Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Hornet ball python. The Hornet consists of 3 genes: the Pastel, the Spider, and the genetic stripe. And essentially what it is, it's a Bumblebee, which is the Pastel Spider, with the addition of the genetic stripe. And it's kind of interesting, it seems like it's not really that common of a name with those 3 genes mixed together. And if you actually go over to Morphmarket.com, it seems like it's pretty rare. There's not a whole lot of them over there. But the thing I find really interesting is that if you actually search for Hornets, you know, most people on some of these names that are not really that common, a lot of times they'll list out the individual genes, and in this case most people actually list them as Hornets. So Hornet is a good name to actually know. If you go to Reptile Show and you see some snakes being sold as Hornets, you'll know exactly what genes are in the mix. So today I want to jump over to the internet and now I want to show you the potential of the Hornet ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the 3 genes that make up the Hornet ball python. And the first one I want to show you is the Pastel. This is what a Pastel looks like. And the Pastel can be really variable. It can be really super bright yellow. I've seen some really super bright, almost fluorescent yellow pastels. And I've seen some pastels that are browned out where you almost can't tell that they're pastels. It can be really variable. And most of them bring out a lot of the yellow in the snake, and a lot of them reduce the pattern too. Sometimes you can get a reduction in pattern to where it's almost tiger striped, and some of them almost have a minimal reduction of pattern. And here is another gene that is in the Hornet. That is the Spider. This is what a Spider looks like. And when it comes to visually impressive morphs, I'd say the Spider is probably one of the most visual standalone morphs. It almost looks like it contains multiple genes. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people that say, hey, tell me the genes that make up the Spider, and believe it or not, it is just one gene. You take a Spider, you breed it to something else, and half the offspring come out as Spider. And the Spider can be pretty variable too. If you actually take a look at the white on the side of the snake, a lot of times it can have white coming all the way up. I'd say this is a really high white example of a Spider, and sometimes it can have almost no white, just like a little bit of freckling of white right on the bottom. And usually with the Spider, you get this really crazy spider web pattern right down the top. I think that's why they call it the Spider. And as a matter of fact, if you take a Spider and you mix it with a Pastel, this is what you get. You get a Bumblebee. You're like one step away from the Hornet. And even the Bumblebee is a really visually impressive snake. And kind of the cool thing about the Bumblebee is there's a whole bunch of slang names that, you know, are kind of a spin-off of the Bumblebee. So this is the Pastel and the Spider, which is the Bumblebee. And if you actually add Enchi into the mix, you get an Enchi Bumblebee, which is also known as a Stinger Bee, which is kind of an interesting name. And if you actually have 2 copies of the Pastel, if you have a Super Pastel Spider, we call that a Killer Bee. So there's all these slang names for all these combinations. If you add genetic stripe, you end up with a Hornet. And I think that's kind of where they're spinning off the names, all these bee names, and they kind of spun it off into the Hornet, another type of bee. And the genetic stripe, I kind of wanted to show you that before we mix it into this combo. And this is what the genetic stripe looks like. Pretty impressive just by itself. And kind of the problem with the genetic stripe is that it's actually a recessive mutation. So you actually need 2 copies of the genetic stripe to actually make a visual. And as far as, you know, the kind of the prices on some of the recessives, you take a look at this one. This one was like 149 plus another 50. It's like 200 bucks. So, you know, it's not really a really high expensive project to get into the Hornets. So if you actually converge all these genes into one snake, you take the genetic stripe, the Spider, and the Pastel, this is what you get. You get the Hornet. Take a look at this. And the Hornet can really vary too from one example to the other. This is probably one of my favorite Hornets. It almost looks like a Spider with a really strong stripe right down the top of the back. And sometimes, depending on the line of Pastel, sometimes it can have a lot of bright yellow and sometimes it can have, you know, a minimal amount of yellow. Here's a couple more examples of the Hornet, and take a look at this one. This one is really crazy. This is probably one of my favorite Hornet combinations, with really bright yellow in the side and just a little bit of white coming up the bottom. This is the Bumblebee genetic stripe. And if you actually take a look at the genes, it's the genetic stripe. You actually need 2 copies of the genetic stripe for a visual, and then you need the Spider and the Pastel. So essentially this is a 4-gene combo. So when you're mixing other genes into the mix, it's a little bit harder because you're dealing with the a recessive, and then the total number of genes is 5, which is a little bit more difficult to actually work with. And if you actually look at this one, this sold for $500, so not too bad for a combination like this, which has recessive in the mix. And here's a couple more. I actually wanted to show you this one. So the Hornets can really vary. This is the same exact genes as the previous two. This has the Pastel, the Spider, and the genetic stripe. And this one has a really super strong stripe right down the top. And I find it kind of interesting that it has its really jet black outline around the top of the stripe. That's kind of interesting. And here's one more. It doesn't always have to have a really strong stripe. I kind of wanted to show you this one because this kind of goes away from the really strong stripe. Sometimes they can be pretty variable. This one almost has like the dotted line right on the top. Pretty amazing combo. And usually with the Spiders, you get really crazy head stamps. I think that's where this kind of crazy head pattern is coming from on this Hornet. Pretty awesome. And if you actually take 2 copies of Pastel, work it into the Hornet, essentially this is what you get. You get the Killer Hornet, kind of a spin-off of the Killer Bee, or the kind of, you know, the Killer Bumblebee. This is the Killer Hornet. This actually has the Super Pastel. This is a little bit harder to hit because it's a Super Pastel, genetic stripe, and Spider. So this is a 5 gene combination. And essentially the Super Pastel really fades it out. And a lot of Super Pastels usually kind of fades the yellow just a little bit. And usually the Super Pastels have a really faded out head. And that's usually a good indication that you have Super Pastel in the mix. So take a look at this. This is actually the Orange Ghost. And let me tell you, I've been looking more and more at the Orange Ghost, and I'm starting to really fall in love with the Orange Ghost combinations. Makes for some really impressive combos. And essentially what it is, it's also a recessive, making it a little bit difficult to work into this project. But the Orange Ghost, if you actually compare it to the Ghost kind of fades out the snake, almost looks like the snake is going into shed. But some of these Orange Ghosts bring out a lot of orange in the mix. It kind of gives you this orange snake that has kind of a really mellow, kind of a faded out color. As a matter of fact, you can actually pick up, I was looking at Orange Ghost, this one was less than $100, which is pretty amazing for a really intense Orange Ghost. Pretty amazing snake. If you take the Orange Ghost and you work it into the Hornet, take a look at this crazy snake, you get like an Orange Hornet, which is pretty crazy. It really brightens the orange, kind of fades it out a little bit. And I think this picture is a little bit underexposed. You could definitely tell that this is a really impressive combination. So take a look at this. This is actually a double recessive. Talk about something that's pretty hard to hit. So you have 2 copies of the genetic stripe, 2 copies of the Orange Ghost, and the Spider and the Pastel. Kind of a crazy combination. And look at the price on this one. Not too bad, $575 for, you know, you figure this is a really difficult combination to actually produce and reproduce. So here is the lesser ball python. The lesser is in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. If you actually take 2 lessers and bring them together, you get an all-white snake with blue eyes. And lesser makes some really amazing combinations, but the kind of the downside of working with the blue-eyed leucistic is that if you breed this with anything else in the blue-eyed leucistic, like the bamboo or the Russo or the mocha, the Mojave, the special, the phantom, all those, a lot of times you'll end up with, sometimes, you know, with like the purple passions, you'll end up with kind of a purplish color snake. But I'd say in most cases, especially with the lesser, I'm pretty sure the lesser is one of the few genes that you mix it with anything in the blue-eyed leucistic, even the phantoms, the specials, and the mystics, and you end up with an all-white snake with blue eyes that masks all the other genes. So it's a little bit more difficult if you have it in a combination and you're breeding it to some other snakes. A lot of times you can accidentally produce the white snake that'll mask all your other genes in the combination. You'll end up with a white snake instead of, you know, like the Hornets and stuff like that. So here's what happens if you work the lesser into the Hornet. Take a look at this. I thought this was kind of an interesting effect. I've kind of run into a lot of these combinations where you work lesser into a lot of combos, and the lesser, usually what it does is a lot of times it'll give you a lot of contrast and definition, bring out a lot of the patterns in the kind of like a brighter color. And I found when you work it into some combos, yellows, you actually get kind of an opposite effect where it really lightens it and kind of mellows out the whole thing. I thought it was kind of an interesting effect where, you know, it almost looks like a Hornet that is kind of faded out. You know, usually you have this really high solid black, like a jet black, right around the line, and it seems like the Lesser really kind of fades that out. It gives you almost like a creamy appearance in this case. Kind of interesting. So here is the Pinstripe, one of my favorite jeans. Matter of fact, if you can actually work Pinstripe into other combinations and still keep the bright gold snake, that is my favorite, you know, with the Pinstripe combinations. And the Pinstripe is actually a dominant mutation. So you mix it with something else, half the offspring come out as Pinstripe or Pinstripe combinations. And here's what happens if you work Pinstripe into the Hornet. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is really wild. Essentially what you get is you get like an almost patternless pinstripe color right on the back of the snake, which is really amazing. And you actually can see kind of really interesting like little flecks of color coming right down the side of the snake, like blacks and golds and yellows. Makes for a really amazing combination. And just the kind of the speckles coming up the head and the high weight coming in from the spider is pretty amazing. And this one's actually called the Spinner Blast Genetic Stripe. So there's quite a few common names that you can actually call some of these snakes. So the Spinner Blast is a combination of the Pinstripe, the Spider, and the Pastel. So this is the Spinner Blast Genetic Stripe. You could also call it the Pinstripe Hornet. And if you actually look at some of these genes, the Pinstripe and the Spider together is also called a Spinner. And then if you mix, let's see, the Spider and the Pastel, that is the Bumblebee. So you kind of have all these common names for kind of this mix of all these different genes. So take a look at this. This is a really nice example of a calico. Usually calicos bring in a lot of the white on the sides of the snake, and sometimes you get a really amazing example of a gene. I'd say this one's probably one of the most amazing calicos that I've ever seen. Bringing the white all the way up and even bringing in some yellow. It looks like just from the calico, it's bringing in some yellow. Makes for a really amazing, probably the best calico I've ever seen. And some of these you can pick up, you know, relatively inexpensive. This one was like $100 plus shipping. Pretty amazing for a really nice calico. And here's what happens if you work calico into the Hornet. Take a look at this. For some reason, the calico completely destroys the whole look of the Hornet, and it almost converts it back into a Bumblebee, where it kind of like completely blasts the pattern and the dominance of the genetic stripe, really bringing the kind of that solid line right down the top. I thought it was kind of interesting. And usually calico, if you work it in with spider, you get some really amazing combinations where the white comes all the way up almost to the top. Makes for probably some of the best spider combinations working calico in with spiders. So there's one last one I wanted to show you here, and that is working banana into the Hornet. It makes for a really impressive combination. And banana is really visually dominant. You work it into other genes and you can almost always see a really strong influence from the banana. And a lot of people say the banana is the same as the coral glow, and I would agree. I think they're pretty much exactly the same. Some people would argue they're a little different. And it's kind of interesting with the coral glows and the bananas. They're actually male makers and female makers. I actually have, as a matter of fact, I actually have coral glows and bananas in my collection, and they're both male makers. So everything I breed those to, all the coral glow or banana offspring will all be males. I won't get any females, which is kind of maddening because, you know, I'd actually like to get some female bananas at some point. And some people, you know, kind of throw out these statistics. You can actually get a female banana if you have a male maker, but the odds are like 1 in 100, and you're figuring, you know, like 6 to 8 eggs a clutch. You know, it's going to take you like 10 years to actually produce a female banana from my male makers. It's kind of frustrating. Kind of a frustrating part of working with bananas. Although I could buy another one that's a female maker and make a whole clutch of female bananas, which would be pretty awesome. So here's what happens if you work banana into the Hornet. Take a look at this crazy snake. It is probably one of my favorite Hornet combinations combinations, and you can definitely see the influence of the banana in this mix. You can see the banana is bringing in a lot of this really strong yellow color in pretty much the whole snake, and you can definitely see the spider coming in, the white coming up the belly, and you can definitely see the genetic stripe right down the top. And of course you also have Pastel, which brings out some more of the color. Pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I was wondering about the price on this one, and I was kind of surprised actually. $400 for a snake like this. I would probably charge more for this, a really amazing combination like this. Pretty amazing combination. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Desmond Warbreck asks, have you made super spiders? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, it's a pretty appropriate question for this video because we're dealing with a combination that contains the spider gene. And I've always heard that if you actually take two spiders and breed them together, it's a lethal combination. Well, you end up with eggs that develop and then they die before they hatch, with the super spider not developing full term. And I've actually seen some people that have actually made a super spider. I haven't actually seen pictures of them or videos, but I've just kind of heard rumors through the grapevine that they made some super spiders, but I would probably avoid it because the spider is kind of susceptible to neurological issues and head wobbles, and it's kind of the same thing with the woma, the hidden gene woma, the champagne, and the spider. They're kind of all in what we call the spider complex, and you really want to avoid breeding two snakes together that are in the spider complex because you can end up with some severe neurological issues. Although I've seen some exceptions to that too. I've seen a lot of people, you know, make some like woma spiders and some crazy stuff like that with no neurological issues at all. So sometimes there's some chances you're taking with some genetic defects, and there's a lot of combinations that a lot of people kind of shy away from just because the odds are there that you can actually have some kind of defect. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.